I don't think my films are in the same range as Bruce's. Bruce's films were primarily...
Chuck's telling me he's in the car with his driver, he looks at the helicopter, it takes off, he watches it fall out of the sky, and everybody gets killed.
Oh my God.
I've been very blessed with my film career. It all began with Bruce Lee.
Chuck Norris is saying goodbye, and it's not what fans think. The man once seen as unstoppable is now facing a tragic diagnosis that's been shrouded in mystery.
As well as I possibly can. You know, I've had to give up my film career.
Insiders claim there's more to the story. A quiet farewell, hidden struggles, and a truth Hollywood doesn't want out.
It was scaring me to death, Penny. You know, and I said, nothing's going on here. She's dying.
Something about Chuck's goodbye just doesn't add up. So, what's happening to him? Let's find out. Chuck Norris, a name that doesn't just echo through time, it roars through it. A man sculpted in the fires of Hollywood mythology, a warrior immortalized in Walker, Texas Ranger, and the only man who ever made Bruce Lee break a sweat in the way of the dragon. For decades, he wasn't just an action star. He was an idea, the embodiment of raw strength, a living symbol of American grit, and a face carved into the very fabric of pop culture.
You were in Bruce Lee's great movies, Return of the Dragon. This is a famous fight scene.
I worked out with Bruce Lee, and I worked out for 3 years. Then he went to Hong Kong to pursue his movie career, did a couple movies, very successful. So he called me up and said, you know, I want to do a movie with a fight scene that everyone will remember.
But behind the invincible facade and the iron fists was a man haunted by ghosts no punch could silence. Beneath the legend was pain, deep, personal, and quietly devastating. Few know that the same man who conquered Hollywood once stood on the battlefield of heartbreak, watching his own brother fall, a loss that ripped through his soul. And when fame promised peace, life gave him chaos instead. Now, at 85, as the curtain seems ready to close, a new darkness has crept in, one that fame, faith, or fortune can't easily defeat. Before we dive in, if Chuck Norris ever meant more to you than just another action hero, hit like, because what you're about to hear isn't the story the poster sold you. The man the world would later call a legend began his journey not in the bright lights of Los Angeles, but in the cold, fractured silence of a broken home, where fear ruled the nights and survival, not childhood, became his daily mission.
How I started in jiu-jitsu, I was in Rio de Janeiro on vacation. And I was going around to all the different martial arts schools and working out.
Carlos Ray Chuck Norris entered this world in 1940 in Ryan, Oklahoma, not as a symbol, but as a scared little boy trapped in a storm of dysfunction. His father, Ray Norris, a World War II veteran, once disappeared in combat, leaving the family to grieve a man they thought was gone forever. When he returned, it wasn't the same man who'd left. The war had chewed him up and spat him out a stranger, a man who drowned his nightmares while his family paid the price.
I said, I gotta find out who they are. So I finally tracked them down in Rio, and I went to their school. And I met Mr. Gracie, the father.
The Chuck Norris the world came to worship was born from that wreckage, a child forged in trauma, built from pain, and driven by a hunger to never be powerless again. Each drink didn't just dull Ray Norris's pain, it erased what little was left of the man inside him. The kindness of a father dissolved into storms of rage so violent, the walls of their home seemed to tremble with fear. The Norris family didn't live together. They endured together, tiptoeing through the wreckage of another night, never knowing when the next explosion would come. In his memoir, Against All Odds, Chuck would later write with brutal honesty that his father became a negative role model, someone I never wanted to become. Those weren't just words. They were the quiet confessions of a boy who learned what strength wasn't long before he learned what it was.
So I asked them if I could work out with them. And they said, very cordial. I said, of course.
His mother, Wilma, was the family's last line of defense, a woman of impossible resilience who held 3 hungry boys together with nothing but grit and faith. Chuck remembered how she'd hide a precious $5 bill to buy food, only for Ray to stumble home, drunk, and snatch it away. Even the smallest sounds, a dripping faucet, a creaking door, could spark chaos when Ray was lost in drink. For young Chuck, home wasn't a refuge. It was a minefield. There were nights that still haunt him. Nights when Ray, too drunk to see straight, would load the family into the car, claiming he was driving them back to Arizona. tires swerved across the road as Wilma wept and begged him to stop. That wasn't a father. It was a storm behind the wheel and a terrified boy clinging to what little faith he had left. Poverty was relentless. Chuck's world offered him no heroes except the ones flickering in black and white at Saturday matinees. Cowboys who stood tall, defended the weak, and never lost their nerve. It was a dream he could afford only when he had a spare dime, but in those brief escapes, he found the blueprint for the man he would one day become.
I was a black belt in judo, so I thought I had some pretty good grappling skills. Anyway, I got on the ground with Hickson Gracie, and it's like I'd never had a lesson in my life.
Then tragedy struck with a cruelty that defied belief. In the early 1950s, his father caused a horrific accident, one that claimed an innocent life and sent Ray to a work camp. The family prayed this would change him, that maybe remorse would replace the bottle. But when he returned, he was worse, angrier, emptier, and more dangerous than before. For Chuck, quiet, withdrawn, failing in school, shame became his shadow. His childhood wasn't about joy or laughter. It was about endurance. And then, at 14, the fear finally snapped. One night when Ray turned his fury toward Wilma, Chuck grabbed a hammer, a trembling, terrified boy standing between his mother and destruction.
He says, I want you to stay here. He says, you got great potential. I can make you a great jiu-jitsu person.
It wasn't the act of a fighter. Not yet. It was the act of a child who'd been broken too many times, finally daring to fight back. A moment that would scar him forever, but also forge the unyielding spirit that the world would one day call legendary. That night, the one where a trembling boy stood between his mother and the man who terrified him, wasn't the end of Chuck Norris's nightmare. It was the spark of a vow, a silent, sacred promise whispered through clenched teeth. I will never become him. That promise would define everything that came after. By 1956, at 16, Chuck's mother, Wilma, had finally reached the breaking point. She gathered her boys, packed what little they had, and fled to California, leaving behind a husband swallowed whole by his demons. It wasn't just an escape. It was an act of defiance, a declaration that their suffering had gone on long enough. Chuck would later say, my mother was the pillar of strength who kept us together when everything was falling apart.
Unfortunately, I was getting ready to do a movie and I couldn't stay there. But I went back to LA and I started training with Hickson Gracie.
And she was. Wilma became his compass in a world that had taught him only fear. Her faith and courage were the faint light that guided him out of the ruins. But the scars of those years didn't fade. They hardened. They became the armor that would one day make him look unbreakable to the world. Because the truth was, Chuck Norris wasn't born a hero. He was forged into one, by pain, by shame, and by the relentless determination to never be that powerless boy again. His resilience wasn't inherited. It was earned in blood and tears. Out of that broken childhood, he began searching for something, anything, that could bring order to the chaos inside him. And in 1958, at just 18, he found it. The United States Air Force became his escape, his chance to rewrite himself from the ground up. Stationed in South Korea, Chuck came face to face with something that would change him forever: martial arts. The shy, invisible boy who once hid from his father's rage now stood on the mat, face to face with the disciplined brutality of Taekwondo and Judo. At first, he stumbled, awkward, uncertain, uncoordinated, but inside him, something ancient and furious woke up.
And I started training with the Machado brothers, who are the cousins of the Gracies, and I've been with them now for 28 years.
Here, for the first time, fear had rules. Pain had purpose. Every fall was a lesson. Every bruise, a reminder that weakness could be transformed into strength. He threw himself into training with a kind of desperation that bordered on obsession. Again and again, he hit the mat. And again, he rose. Later, he'd say, I was a very shy kid, not much of an athlete, not a standout in school. But martial arts gave me an identity. It gave me a reason to believe in myself.
It was when we were hitting it so hard. We were having a real rough time, back then we were very poor.
That belief became his weapon. What started as a way to control his fear became his destiny. When Chuck returned home to California in 1962, he wasn't just a young man leaving the service. He was a storm contained in human form. He came back with the discipline of a soldier and the fire of a fighter, a man no longer running from his past, but ready to conquer it. Determined to turn his newfound passion into a way of life, Chuck Norris threw himself into the grind. He became a military police officer, a job that that demanded control, precision, and discipline, all the traits he'd been desperately building since Korea. But deep down, he wanted more than a uniform. He wanted purpose. So, with nothing but courage and a few borrowed dollars, he took a gamble that could have ruined him. He opened his very first karate school.
How old was he when all this
14.
was? 14. That's quite a load of responsibility.
It was a load
for
of
a 14.
responsibility.
It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't crowded. It was a dim, modest storefront with mats that smelled of sweat and hope. Some days the room stayed empty. Chuck would sweep the floorboards in silence, waiting for students who never showed. The echo of his own footsteps reminded him how fragile dreams could be. The money ran out faster than it came in. Doubt whispered louder than ever, but quitting was not an option. Not for a man who had already survived hell. Because Chuck wasn't fighting for profit, he was fighting for freedom. Every class, every empty hour in that lonely dojo was a rebellion against the boy who once cowered in fear. He wasn't just teaching martial arts. He was proving that pain could be turned into purpose. By the early 1960s, that purpose became obsession. Chuck began entering karate tournaments, not for fame, not for glory, but to test the man he had become. And the results? Brutal. He lost. Again and again. Each defeat hit harder than the last, reviving the same helplessness that had haunted him as a child. The trophies went to others. The shame stayed with him.
He always was like the man in the house because his father wasn't there. And so he would, when I worked nights, he'd babysit for the two kids.
But if his father's rage had once broken him, these losses rebuilt him. He didn't run from the pain. He studied it. He drilled every movement until his body stopped being clumsy and became calculated. Every strike was measured, every kick refined, every setback transformed into a lesson. He wasn't born the best. He became it through obsession. Between 1964 and 1967, he endured a string of failures that would have broken most men, but each one forged him tighter, sharper, harder. Until finally, in 1967, at 27 years old, Chuck Norris did the unthinkable. He won his first major championship, and then he didn't stop. From that point on, the karate world belonged to him. He dominated the circuit, becoming the professional middleweight karate champion, and he held that title for 6 straight years. 6 years of punishing discipline, brutal training, and unrelenting dominance.
Chuck Norris, for example, was a 3, 4, 5-time world champion, and they tried to equate that with his ability as a street fighter.
But Chuck's real victory wasn't in the trophies or the applause. It was in the transformation itself. He had turned the fear of a broken childhood into the fire that fueled a warrior. The boy who once shook in terror had become the man whose name would one day strike fear into others. He didn't just open karate schools, he built sanctuaries for the broken. Across America, Chuck Norris planted the seeds of discipline, respect, and self-belief. His dojos weren't about violence, they were about victory, the kind that starts inside. Each student who walked through his door found more than an instructor. They found a man who had already fought the war they were fighting, against fear, against doubt, against their own demons.
Teaching a class for this instructor, and a guy walked in. And when he walked in, it was like an air of animosity just kind of flowed into the studio. And I looked around and I saw him staring right at me, and he had hostility in his eyes.
Chuck taught more than technique. He taught the art of survival. Every defeat hurt, he once admitted, but each one pushed me closer to the man I wanted to become. I realized that losing was only permanent if you quit, and I wasn't going to quit. What began as a desperate dream from a poor, terrified boy in Oklahoma had become a living, breathing legacy. One built strike by strike, scar by scar, day after relentless day. By the dawn of the 1970s, Chuck Norris wasn't just a fighter. He was a symbol. Proof that pain could be weaponized into purpose, that no matter how broken your past, discipline and faith could still sculpt something extraordinary from the wreckage. And then came 1972, the moment that would etch his name into cinematic history. The Way of the Dragon, Rome's Colosseum, Bruce Lee, the ultimate showdown between East and West, legend and challenger. The world saw a duel of gods, lightning fast, brutal, iconic. But behind the clenched fists and perfect choreography, Chuck carried a hidden fear. That history would remember him only as the man Bruce Lee defeated, that all his years of struggle would be reduced to one scripted loss.
I've been very blessed with my film career. It all began with Bruce Lee.
But that scene, that legendary clash, did the opposite. It didn't bury him, it birthed him. Hollywood couldn't ignore the power in his presence, the focus in his eyes, the quiet intensity that made audiences believe every punch was real. He wasn't just another martial artist, he was a force. Still, fame didn't roll out a red carpet. The late 1970s in Hollywood was a war zone of egos and muscle. Stallone, Schwarzenegger, Eastwood, giants who already owned the box office. Chuck's early films stumbled, struggling to find an audience that saw him as more than the karate guy.
I don't think my films are in the same range as Bruce's. Bruce's films were primarily...
But just like in the ring, he refused to quit. He fought back the only way he knew how, through relentless perseverance. Then, in 1978, it happened. Good Guys Wear Black. At 38, Chuck finally broke through, embodying the clean-cut, patriotic hero a weary America had been craving. The man who didn't curse, didn't crack, didn't flinch. He stood for something, and when the door opened, he kicked it down. The Octagon, 1980. Lone Wolf McQuade, 1983. Missing in Action, 1984. Code of Silence, 1985. The Delta Force, 1986. Each film hit harder, cementing his image not just as a martial arts star, but as a cultural weapon, the embodiment of American toughness in a world that seemed to be losing its grip on it. Audiences didn't just watch Chuck Norris, they believed in him. He wasn't playing a hero, he was one. But for Chuck, every triumph came with a shadow, a sorrow too deep for applause to wash away. Because every time he slipped into the uniform of a soldier or stepped onto a battlefield set, one name echoed in his heart. His younger brother, Wyland, in Vietnam at just 21. Chuck once confessed, "His death left a hole in my heart that will never heal." No amount of fame or fortune could fill that void. Behind every blockbuster and every standing ovation was a man quietly carrying wounds the box office could never mend. The roaring success of the 1980s, the movies, the fame, the legend, wasn't built on ego or luck. It was built on pain, endurance, and an iron will to turn tragedy into purpose. That's what made his performances hit deeper than just punches and kicks. Audiences felt something real in his eyes, even if they didn't know the story behind them.
He said, "Would you come over and do the fight scene with me?" I said, "Well, do I have to lose?" He says, "Yeah, you have to lose." I said, "All right." So I went over there. I'd seen his first two movies. I said, "The guys you fight don't even have a chance. They don't even touch you." And he said, "No, we'll make this a seesaw battle."
By the mid-1980s, Chuck had become America's action hero, the calm, unstoppable force the nation longed for. His fists seemed carved from steel. His presence radiated quiet strength. But behind the camera, another kind of battle raged. Grueling filming schedules, stunt injuries that left his body battered, and months away from his family all took their toll. Stardom, much like combat, demanded sacrifice. And though the world saw a man of unbreakable power, Chuck privately fought through exhaustion, loneliness, and the burden of keeping that heroic image alive. Still, the same discipline that shaped him as a martial artist and the resilience forged in childhood pain carried him forward. And in 1993, at age 53, came the role that would make him immortal, Walker, Texas Ranger.
He respected me because of my ability as a world champion.
Did you guys ever go at it in a real situation?
No, I was a professional fighter. Bruce was very, very good, but he never fought.
For 8 unbroken seasons until 2001, Chuck became Cordell Walker, the lawman whose fists of justice and unwavering moral compass became symbols of honor around the world. Broadcast in over 100 countries, the show turned Chuck Norris into a global icon. His name forever linked to strength, integrity, and indestructibility. Children saw him as the hero who never fell. Adults respected the quiet dignity he brought to every frame. Even as pop culture turned him into a legend of jokes and memes, those only amplified his myth, proof of just how deeply he had imprinted himself on the world. Yet even at the height of fame, one truth remained: no applause could erase grief, and no camera could capture the battles fought within. Behind the unstoppable hero stood a man shaped by loss, discipline, and heartache. A man who turned pain into purpose and rose from it to become a legend the world would never forget.
And so when we would figure out our bills and things to be paid, we would sit down together and see what we could pay.
A man whose greatest victories were never confined to the screen, but found in the unbreakable resilience that carried him through life's hardest blows. Chuck Norris didn't just rise. He endured time and again, every time the world tried to bring him to his knees. Each time he donned the uniform of a soldier for a role, audiences roared with applause. But when the lights dimmed and the camera stopped, Chuck faced a much deeper battlefield, one carved into his heart by unbearable loss. His younger brother Wyland had been the heartbeat heartbeat of the Norris family, the one who could turn silence into laughter, who brought warmth into a home long shadowed by hardship. But behind that bright spirit, Weiland carried a quiet, haunting sense of fate. He once told Chuck that he didn't think he'd live to see his 27th birthday, a confession brushed off at the time as passing melancholy. But in 1970, while serving in Vietnam, that grim premonition became a devastating reality.
I believe you were too old for Vietnam, but your brother went. You lost a brother in Vietnam. Right.
At just 21, Weiland was walking point on a patrol when he spotted the enemy lying in wait. In that split second, he shouted a warning, saving the men behind him, but sacrificing his own life. It was an act of pure, selfless heroism, the kind that transcends words or medals. But for Chuck and his family, it shattered their world beyond repair. The telegram that arrived at their door was like a blade through the soul. Their mother, who had already survived poverty, heartbreak, and violence, was now forced to bear the most unnatural pain of all, losing her child. Chuck would later say that Weiland's death left a hole in my heart that will never heal. And it wasn't a poetic line for the press, it was the unvarnished truth.
Yeah, he was on a patrol, and he was point man on the patrol, and he saw an ambush being set up by the Viet Cong, and he saw them getting ready to fire on his patrol.
Even as his movies dominated the 1980s box office, as his on-screen victories made him a symbol of indestructible strength, Chuck was quietly living with the weight of that loss. Every time he slipped into uniform for a film, every time he shouldered a rifle or walked through a staged firefight, he wasn't just acting. He was revisiting a memory that never let him go. The thunder of explosions on set, the echo of shouted commands, the smoke and chaos, all of it brought him back to that one terrible day in 1970, when war didn't just claim soldiers overseas, but reached into his own family and stole a brother who should have grown old beside him. Behind every cinematic victory was a silent grief, and behind every hero the world saw, there stood a man forever marked by love, loss, and the kind of courage born only from heartbreak. In the late 1980s, Chuck formed a close friendship with Lee Atwater, the brilliant, fiery political strategist, whose mind seemed to run on pure electricity. On paper, they couldn't have been more different. One, a martial artist and actor. The other, a rising star in Washington's ruthless political arena. Yet together, they found something rare, an unspoken understanding, the kind of easy camaraderie that made the world outside fall away.
I would approach that issue as a statistician or a political scientist, or no, as a psychologist, which I'm not. Is how abstract.
They shared long nights of laughter, music, and conversation. Two men from opposite worlds bound by loyalty and mutual respect. For Chuck, Lee was more than a friend. He was a confidant, a reminder that behind fame and power, the simplest thing, genuine connection, mattered most. Then, in March 1990, tragedy struck. While giving a speech, Lee suddenly collapsed before a stunned audience. Hours later, the diagnosis came. He was just 39. For Chuck, the news hit like a thunderclap. He had seen death before, through the lens of war, through the loss of his brother. But this was different. This was a friend, vibrant and unstoppable, now trapped in a battle no one could win.
You know, I was behind it. I'm one of these ultra-patriotic type guys. But, you know, reflecting back, and not even with losing Willie, but just the, going back and realizing what kind of a war it was.
In the months that followed, Chuck visited often. He watched as Lee's sharp wit dimmed, his boundless energy fading into frailty. The once unbreakable man who had lit up every room was slowly being erased by an illness that showed no mercy. Chuck later recalled one visit that never left him. He leaned over, kissed his friend's forehead, and walked quietly out of the room, only to break down in tears in the hallway. The man who had faced countless enemies on screen, who had endured every pain life could throw at him, was undone by the sight of a friend slipping away before his eyes. It was another cruel lesson, that even heroes can't protect the ones they love from fate, that no amount of strength can stop time from claiming those who make life worth living.
It was a war of monetary gains rather than a war of principle, even though they say that is the reason. Too many people became very rich from the Vietnam War.
And I think it was a mistake we made.
In March 1991, just a year after his collapse, Lee Atwater passed away at only 40 years old. For Chuck Norris, it wasn't just the loss of a dear friend. It was the shattering of an illusion he'd clung to his entire life, that strength, discipline, and willpower could somehow guard a man against mortality. If it could happen to him, Chuck would later admit quietly, it could happen to me. It was a haunting realization, one that stripped away the last layers of invincibility the world had painted over him. For the first time, Chuck truly faced the truth he'd spent decades outrunning. No amount of fame, no number of trophies or cheers could hold back time. Watching Lee's casket sink into the ground, the applause of audiences and the glitter of success suddenly felt small, almost meaningless.
I think it was a war that could not be won. And we just have to avoid those in the future, wars that don't serve a strong enough purpose. They're just saying, well, we were there to avoid communism, but...
Lee's death became a mirror, reflecting back not just loss, but the painful truth that life, for all its beauty and triumph, is heartbreakingly fragile. And yet within that grief, Chuck found clarity. From the memory of his friend, he drew a deeper resolve to live each day with purpose, to cherish every moment, and to never take love or time for granted again. Lee Atwater's passing carved another scar into Chuck Norris's heart, one etched with lessons of mortality and grace. It whispered that even in the face of sorrow, friendship leaves behind a light that never fades, a quiet glow that guides those left behind toward gratitude and meaning. But if losing his brother had scarred him, if losing his marriage had shaken him, and if losing his friend had forced him to confront his own mortality, nothing could have prepared him for the battle that came next. Because this time, the enemy wasn't war, loneliness, or time. It was something far more personal, the fight for the life of the woman he loved.
You know, these people here, all they're concerned about is eating from day to day, not whether it's a democratic or communistic society, but where am I going to get my next meal? That's what these people are concerned with.
After years of solitude, Chuck found love again with Gina O'Kelly, a former model whose presence reignited his spirit. They married in 1998. He was 58, she just 35. Her warmth and laughter filled the empty spaces left by pain and loss, breathing color back into a life that had known too much gray. In 2001, their joy multiplied with the birth of twins, Dakota and Dana Lee, a late-in-life blessing that turned their home into a haven of noise, chaos, and laughter. For more than a decade, the Norris household radiated peace, the kind Chuck had spent a lifetime searching for.
The woman right next to me is my wife, my beautiful wife, who we've been married now for 20 years, and she really takes care of me.
After so many years of fighting battles on screen and off, he finally found his quiet victory: love, family, and the serenity of a life rebuilt from ashes. But that peace, like all things Chuck had cherished before, would soon be tested in ways no man, no warrior, could ever prepare for. By 2013, Chuck was 73 and Gina 52, and their family seemed blessed with a second chance at happiness. But then came the cruelest twist of all. That year, Gina underwent what should have been a routine MRI scan, a simple precaution meant to protect her health. Instead, it brought devastation. The gadolinium used in the procedure triggered what doctors would later recognize as symptoms of gadolinium deposition disease, a rare, little-known condition that sent her nervous system into chaos. Soon after the scan, Gina began to tremble uncontrollably. Her limbs weakened, her voice faltered until even words became nearly impossible.
I had horrible brain damage. I couldn't think anymore. Any type of cognition, being able to articulate, my memory. I had muscle wasting.
The woman Chuck adored, the mother of his young twins, was suddenly trapped in a nightmare neither of them could escape. Doctors searched desperately for answers, but each day seemed darker than the last. There were countless nights when Chuck sat by her hospital bed, holding her hand as machines hummed softly around them, watching helplessly as she fought to speak. Her once bright smile faded into silence. More than $2 million went into treatments, but no amount could buy back the peace of seeing her whole and healthy again. Chuck later admitted that those years broke him in ways the world could never see. "She's dying right in front of me," he confessed, his voice trembling with anguish.
It was scaring me to death, Betty.
Yeah.
You know, and I said, nothing's going on here. She's dying.
She's dying right in front of me.
To fans, he was still the indestructible hero of Walker, Texas Ranger. But at home, he was simply a husband in despair, pacing hospital corridors, praying through sleepless nights, and surrendering every ounce of himself to save his wife. He gave up films, public appearances, and the career that had defined him for decades, retreating from the spotlight so he could devote every moment to her side. Hollywood lost an icon, but Gina gained a guardian, one who refused to let go for even a heartbeat.
Whole life is focused on keeping her as well as I possibly can. You know, I've had to give up my film career.
The ordeal didn't just weigh on Chuck. For Gina, once healthy and radiant, the loss of independence was crushing. She watched the man she loved sacrifice everything for her, and her pain deepened with guilt, knowing his world now revolved around her suffering. For their twins, only 12 at the time, childhood was forever marked by hospital visits and the haunting image of their mother in pain. They saw their father cry for the first time, a memory that would shape their understanding of love and fragility forever. The years that followed were a relentless trial. Experimental treatments, long hospital stays, journeys across continents in search of answers, even a desperate trip to China for stem cell therapy. Each setback threatened to break their spirit, yet Chuck refused to surrender. The discipline forged in the dojo now fueled a far more sacred fight to keep hope alive when medicine faltered. He became not the warrior on screen, but the warrior at home, measuring victory not in trophies, but in the endurance of love. Through it all, the world began to see a different Chuck Norris. Stripped of the armor of invincibility, he revealed the truest form of strength, not the kind that defeats enemies, but the kind that kneels beside a suffering loved one and whispers, "I'm not leaving." The man once mythologized as indestructible became, in truth, the most human of husbands, defined not by fame, but by devotion. The pain of watching Gina suffer became his greatest heartbreak, but also his greatest testimony. That real heroes are not those who conquer on screen, but those who remain unyielding through life's cruelest storms. In caring for Gina, Chuck proved that love itself is the most powerful force of all. Stronger than pain, stronger than despair, strong enough to carry a family through the darkest chapter of their lives.
I feel really bad about the people that are going through this that don't have the money like I am fortunate enough to have to be able to get these things done. And so it's really frustrating.
At 85 years old, Chuck Norris lives a life that appears serene on the surface. Yet beneath that quiet lies the weight of decades, memories, battles, and scars that never truly fade. He resides with his wife, Gina O'Kelly, on their sprawling ranch in Navasota, Texas, a sanctuary of hundreds of acres valued in the tens of millions, where the family raises horses and bottles Sea Force, the pure spring water Chuck transformed into both a business and a legacy. Beyond the ranch, he owns other properties, including a residence near Dallas. His fortune, estimated at around $70 million, stands as a testament to decades of martial arts triumphs, blockbuster films, television stardom, and ventures beyond the screen. But to measure Chuck Norris by numbers is to misunderstand him entirely. Wealth can buy land, homes, even medical treatments, but it cannot buy back time, nor erase the shadows that visit him in the quiet hours of night. His days now revolve around Gina, who continues to bear the lasting scars of her health crisis. Though she has found stability after years of pain, Chuck remains constantly at her side, vigilant, tender, and aware that every moment together is borrowed time. That's it for today. See you in the next video. Until then, goodbye.